Ever tried to cram a novel's worth of text into a tweet?
Yeah.
Yeah, some AI models have that problem too. They really struggle with those long sequences of data.
Yeah. It's a huge limitation, especially when you think about how much of the information we work with every day is sequential, whether it's text or DNA or audio.
Right, exactly. So today we are diving into some cutting-edge research on a new architecture called Mamba. It's specifically designed to tackle this problem, and, well, the results are pretty exciting.
Mob is making waves because it aims to process those long sequences not just effectively, but also with incredible speed and efficiency, potentially even surpassing the performance of some of those leading models out there.
Okay, you've got my attention. But before we get into Mamba itself, can you remind me why this long sequence thing is such a big challenge for AI?
Sure. So the dominant architecture right now, the transformers, they depend on something called the attention mechanism. Now, attention is great for analyzing relationships within a sequence, but it gets super computationally expensive as that sequence grows longer. You can almost imagine it like trying to have a conversation with like 100 people at once and remembering every detail of what everyone said. It's a lot to handle.
That's a great analogy. So it's not just about speed, right? It's about memory and processing power as well.
Exactly. And that's where Mamba steps in. Instead of relying on that attention mechanism, it leverages something called selective state space models, or SSMs for short.
SSMs. Now that sounds a little bit technical. Is there a way to understand this without, a PhD in computer science?
Absolutely. Think of SSMs as combining the strengths of two other popular neural networks. RNNs, which are great at remembering information from the past, and CNNs, which are good at picking out patterns no matter where they are in the sequence. So SSMs have that kind of memory that RNNs do, but they can also process information simultaneously like CNNs.
So they're like the multitaskers of the AI world. They remember and they analyze all at the same time. But what makes Mamba's approach to SSMs unique?
It all boils down to selectivity. Mamba's SSMs have this built-in selection mechanism that lets them zoom in on the most important parts of a sequence and filter out all the noise. Kind of like when you're reading a news article, you don't memorize every single word, you pick out the key points.
So it's like Mamba has its own little internal highlighter. But how does it know what's important? Does it have like a built-in understanding of, language or DNA or whatever it's processing?
Well, not exactly. What it does is it learns what's important based on the specific task it's doing and the surrounding context. And it does this by making its SSM parameters input dependent, meaning they actually adjust based on what it's processing at that moment.
So the same word or, say, the same gene could be treated differently depending on what comes before or after it.
That's right.
That's really clever. But what does this selectivity actually mean in practice? Why should we care?
Well, for one thing, it makes Mamba incredibly efficient. By honing in on the most relevant info, it can process those long sequences way faster and use a lot less computational power. But it's not just about speed, there's more to it.
Okay, I'm listening. What else does this selectivity bring to the table?
Well, it also helps Mamba avoid distractions. Some AI models, they kind of get sidetracked by irrelevant information, and that can hurt their performance. But Mamba's selectivity helps it stay laser focused on what it needs to do. It's like a runner with blinders on, They just see the finish line.
So it's not just processing speed, it's about accuracy and focus too. I'm really starting to see why Mamba is generating so much buzz. But I have to ask, how did they actually test this selectivity? How do we know it's really working?
So they put Mamba through a series of tasks specifically designed to evaluate its selective capabilities. One was the selective copying task, where it had to remember certain tokens within a sequence and ignore others, even if their positions were all mixed up.
So it's like trying to remember a phone number someone's reciting to you in a really noisy room. You have to pick out the digits while ignoring all the background chatter.
You got it. And Mamba was fantastic at this, showing its ability to focus on what mattered and tune out all the distractions. But that's not all. They also tested it on something called induction heads, which is a bit more complex.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are induction heads, and what do they tell us about Mamba?
So induction heads, it's basically a task that tests how well a model can learn from context. It's about recognizing patterns and then making predictions based on what it's already seen. Kind of like figuring out the next ingredient in a recipe based on what's already in the bowl,
So if I say peanut butter and jelly, you'd predict jelly because you've seen that combo before.
Precisely. And this ability to learn from context, it's a big part of what makes large language models so powerful. And Mamba, well, it just aced this test. It could accurately predict what came next based on the patterns it had seen.
That's impressive. So it seems like Mamba is ticking all the boxes so far, right?
Yeah.
Speed, efficiency, focus, and that ability to learn from context.
Yeah.
But how does it actually stack up against the competition? How did it perform compared to other AI models out there?
Well, they really put Mamba through the ringer. They compared it to some of the top models out there, including Transformers, which is, the current champ. They even tested it against like a supercharged version of the Transformer, just to be sure.
So they threw Mamba into the deep end. How did it fare against those heavy hitters?
It held its own. In fact, it achieved comparable performance to the standard Transformer, and in some cases even surpassed it, especially when dealing with those longer sequences.
That's amazing. So were Transformers the only models Mamba was tested against? What about other alternatives that are out there?
Right, so they also compared it against several other models that are specifically designed to be more efficient than Transformers. Models like Hyena, RWKV, RetNet, some of those rising stars in the efficient AI world.
Sounds like it was a real clash of the titans. How did Mamba measure up in that showdown?
It came out on top, so they looked at what are called scaling laws, which basically measure how a model's performance changes as you increase its size and the amount of data it's trained on. And Mamba's scaling laws were better than all the other models in the test.
Okay, so it's beating the standard Transformer and outperforming models that are specifically designed for efficiency. That's a pretty strong endorsement. But I gotta ask, did they only test Mamba on these kind of technical benchmarks, or did they try it out on real-world problems too?
Yeah, they didn't just stick to benchmarks. They also tested Mamba on a range of those downstream tasks, like, question answering, text summarization, even things like common sense reasoning. And they did all this in what's called a zero-shot setting.
Zero shot. Does that mean Mamba wasn't specifically trained for those tasks? Like they just threw it in the deep end and said, figure it out?
That's exactly it. Like giving someone a tool they've never seen before and saying, okay, build something. It's a real test of a model's ability to generalize its knowledge.
So how did our AI MacGyver do? Was it able to rise to the challenge?
It did remarkably well. They compared Mamba to some of the best open source language models out there. Models like Pythia, RWKV, the ones that have been trained on massive amounts of data and are considered, top performers.
So Mamba was up against the best of the best. How did it do?
It consistently outperformed the competition, often getting results that were comparable to models twice its size.
So it's not just efficient, it's really effective at solving real-world problems too.
Yeah.
I'm really starting to see the potential here. But you mentioned earlier that Mamba is still in its early stages, right? So are there any limitations or challenges that need to be addressed as it develops?
That's a great question. And you're right. While Mamba is showing a ton of promise, it's still a young technology. One challenge is making sure that efficiency scales up as the model gets bigger. So far, it's performed really well at smaller scales, but we need to see if that holds up as it grows.
So it's like making sure a car that gets great gas mileage in the city can still maintain that on the highway.
A perfect analogy. And another challenge is figuring out how to fine-tune Mamba for specific tasks. Right now, it's showing amazing zero-shot performance, but there's probably even more potential to unlock if we can tailor it for specific applications.
Like having a multi-tool that's great for, general use, but sometimes you need to sharpen a specific blade for a particular job.
Exactly. And they're also working on developing new training methods specifically for Mamba's unique architecture. So that could lead to even better performance and efficiency down the line.
So it's not just about making Mamba bigger, it's about making it smarter and more adaptable. This is all really exciting, but I'm wondering about the potential trade-offs. Is there a downside to this focus on efficiency?
That's a great point. One area they're looking at is how Mamba handles different types of data, specifically the differences between what's called continuous data, like audio waveforms, and discrete data, like text or DNA sequences.
Could you elaborate on that a bit? I'm not sure I fully understand the distinction.
Sure. So continuous data, that can take on any value within a certain range. Think of like the temperature outside or the volume of a sound. Discrete data, on the other hand, is made up of distinct separate values, like the words in a sentence or the letters in DNA.
Okay, got it. So how does this relate to Mamba's performance?
Well, Mamba's architecture was originally designed with continuous data in mind, and it's been incredibly successful in areas like, audio modeling. But they've also made some modifications to help it handle discrete data, like language and DNA.
So they've kind of bridged the gap between those two data types.
Exactly. But it's possible that those modifications, while helpful for discrete data, might come at a slight cost to its performance on continuous data.
So it's a balancing act, trying to find that sweet spot where it can handle both types of data effectively.
Precisely. And that's an area where more research is definitely needed to understand those trade-offs and really fine-tune Mamba for different data types.
It sounds like there's still a lot to learn about Mamba and what it can really do. What are the researchers most excited about? What are the next steps in Mamba's development? So we've talked a lot about Mamba's potential for things like language processing, but I'm really curious about these other applications you mentioned, especially in areas like genomics and audio. Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. Let's start with genomics. You remember how we were talking about DNA being like a language with its own kind of letters and words?
Yes, and how analyzing that requires models that can handle these really long sequences and spot those subtle patterns.
Exactly. That's where Mamba really shines. So the researchers actually tested it on a few different genomic tasks, including one where they pre-trained Mamba on a massive data set of human DNA sequences.
So basically teaching it the language of our genes.
Yeah, you got it. They used a technique called causal language modeling, where the model learns to predict the next base pair in a sequence, kind of like predicting the next word in a sentence. And what they found was that Mamba's performance on this task just kept getting better and better as they increased the sequence length.
Which I guess makes sense, given what we know about its ability to handle those long stretches of genetic code. But how did it actually compare to other models that are specifically designed for DNA analysis? Did it hold its own?
Oh, it more than held its own. They compared it to some of the heavy hitters in the field, including one called hyena DNA, and of course they threw a souped-up transformer into the mix as well. And Mamba's performance actually scaled better than both of those models.
So meaning it achieved lower error rates with fewer parameters as they increased the model size.
Exactly. But maybe the most fascinating test of all was the Great Apes DNA classification task we touched on earlier. Remember, the challenge there was to distinguish between closely related species, like humans, chimps, and gorillas, based on just tiny variations in their DNA.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but the needle is a tiny genetic variation. And they used those really long sequences to make it even harder, right?
Yeah, they really pushed Mamba to its limits, and yet it still achieved some really impressive accuracy in classifying those different species. So it really demonstrated its ability to handle not just the complexity of that task, but also the sheer length of those sequences.
So not only is Mamba proving valuable for understanding human language, it might help us unlock some of the secrets hidden in our own DNA.
Absolutely. But we can't forget about audio modeling. Mamba's knack for handling long sequences also makes it a great fit for audio data, which is basically just one long stream of sound waves, right?
So how did they test out Mamba's audio skills? Did they have it composing symphonies or something?
Not quite symphonies, but they did try it out on something called autoregressive audio generation, where the model has to predict the next sample in an audio wave form.
So kind of like predicting the next note in a melody or the next word in a song.
Exactly. It takes a model that can pick up on those subtle patterns and dependencies in the audio signal, just like with language or DNA. And Mamba, well, it excelled at this too, achieving some state-of-the-art results.
Okay, you've officially impressed me.
Yeah.
But was there anything particularly surprising about its performance on audio?
Yeah, actually. What was really interesting is that Mamba's performance actually got better as the audio context got longer.
Wait, so the more it heard, the better it got at predicting what came next.
Yeah.
Most models really struggle with those longer sequences, don't they?
Exactly. But Mamba seems to thrive on them. It's that combination of those selective state space models and that clever hardware-aware algorithm. It really allows it to handle those longer sequences without breaking a sweat.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's clear that Mamba isn't just a one-trick pony. It's incredibly versatile. It can handle all sorts of different domains, from language and DNA to music. It's really something.
And that's why it's so revolutionary. It's not just a step forward, it's a leap. Mamba is giving us a glimpse into a future where AI can just effortlessly process and understand massive amounts of sequential information, regardless of where it comes from.
It's really exciting to think about. So for our listeners who are trying to keep up with all of this, what would you say are the key takeaways from our deep dive into Mamba today?
Well, I think first and foremost, Mamba represents a fundamentally new and efficient way to process sequential information. Those selective state space models really allow it to capture those long-range dependencies without sacrificing speed or efficiency.
And it's not just efficient, it's incredibly effective. We saw that it's achieving some really cutting-edge results across all sorts of tasks, from language modeling and question answering to DNA analysis and even audio generation.
Right. And perhaps most importantly, its versatility really opens up a world of possibilities. Think about new applications across tons of different fields. It could revolutionize everything, from scientific discovery to personalized medicine, from music composition to our understanding of human evolution. Who knows?
It sounds like as researchers continue to explore what Mamba can do, we can expect some truly groundbreaking advancements in the years to come.
It really does feel like we're on the cusp of something big. It's an exciting time to be in the AI field, that's for sure.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Mamba for today. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey into the cutting edge of AI research.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And this is The Deep Dive, signing off.